He was a prince no one was allowed to see. While his brothers posed for portraits and led armies, Prince John was hidden, locked away at age 11, erased by 13. He didn't die in war. He died in a seizure, alone, in a cottage meant to silence him. His only crime? He was born with epilepsy, and that made him too broken for the throne, too human for a crown. The summer of 1905 arrived gently in Norfolk, with warm breezes sweeping across the green fields of Sandringham and birds nesting softly in the eaves of York Cottage, the lesser-known residence tucked away in the estate's quieter corner. Far from the polished splendor of Buckingham Palace or Windsor's ceremonial halls. And within its white walls, creaking with age and modest compared to royal standards, a cry pierced the stillness, one that did not belong to any of the footmen or maids, but to a newborn boy, red-cheeked and wriggling, whose first breath carried both the weight of royalty and the burden of expectation. They named him John Charles Francis, a name that echoed nobility and tradition, carefully chosen to reflect the heritage of the House of Windsor, then still known as the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, but also soft enough to suit the sixth child in a family already filled with crowns, titles, and dynastic plans. Born to King George V, at the time still the Duke of York, and Princess Mary of Teck, the child entered the world surrounded by gold-framed portraits, an overstaffed nursery, and a family for whom duty stood firmer than affection. And yet, in those first days, he was simply a baby, plump, giggling, kicking his legs at the air with no knowledge of titles or burdens, no clue that he would grow up in the shadow of something vast, cold, and ultimately unreachable. He was the youngest of 6, preceded by princes and a princess, each already marked by their expected future. Edward, the heir presumptive, with a golden curl and a restless stare. Albert, the quiet one, who would later become George VI. Mary, the only girl, dignified even as a child. And then there was John, the afterthought in the royal narrative. The punctuation mark at the end of a lineage too occupied with thrones and treaties to make room for anything unpredictable. At first there was no sign, no clear indication that something was amiss. The nurses who attended him remarked on his sweet nature, his easy laugh, the way he clutched their fingers with surprising strength. But soon, whispers began to ripple through the halls. Not loud, not scandalous, just subtle observations shared in linen closets and between closed nursery doors. He blinks too slowly, one nanny noted. He doesn't respond when spoken to, another added. There's a softness to him that the others didn't have. The Queen, then still Princess Mary, watched with a wary eye. She loved him in the way royal mothers were permitted to love, at a distance filtered through protocol and nannies and nurses and governesses. But there was also an unease in her gaze, a stiffness in her arms as she held him, less a cradle and more a pose for a photograph. She had given birth to 6 children in under 10 years, each one a link in the chain of royal continuity. And John, the last, arrived with something different in his silence, in the way his limbs moved, not quite in rhythm with his peers, in the flickers behind his eyes that made even seasoned doctors tilt their heads and frown. And though no one dared speak it aloud, a quiet sense of apprehension began to settle in the royal household, like a fog that refused to lift. It wasn't fear, not yet. But it was the beginning of something colder, anticipatory shame, the kind that waits in silence for a child to fail expectations he never agreed to carry. As the months passed and John grew into a toddler, his differences became harder to ignore. He was late to walk, late to speak. When he did speak, it was in fragments, half thoughts and mimicry, his words often drowned by laughter or lost in sudden silence. He found comfort not in his siblings or structured games, but in repetitive motions, in chasing light on the carpet, in lining up toys in precise rows only he understood. And when startled or overwhelmed, he would cry with a sharpness that pierced through the palace walls like a siren, causing servants to glance at one another nervously before resuming their duties as though nothing had happened. His father, George, stoic, reserved, and every inch the image of a constitutional monarch in training, remained distant. He never openly rejected the boy, but neither did he reach for him. To George, sons were symbols, heirs, warriors, diplomatic tools. And a son who didn't walk properly, who didn't follow commands, who didn't behave in ways befitting his birth, was quietly placed into another category altogether. Not quite a prince, not quite a problem. Just quietly other. There was still hope, though, at least among the household staff. The nannies who spent their days with him often grew attached. They called him Johnny, brushed his soft hair with care, and tried to shield him from the cold edge of royal disappointment. For in the few moments where he felt safe, his joy was infectious. He would laugh so hard he fell over, chase butterflies through the garden until he tripped into the roses, or clap his hands when the wind shook the trees. He was, in those moments, a child like any other. Delicate, yes, but vividly alive. But the palace did not know what to do with delicacy. The royal machine, built on rigidity and tradition, had no gears for softness, no compartment for confusion. John could not be molded. He did not behave as expected. He could not perform the rituals of princely life, standing still for portraits, bowing on cue, smiling at dignitaries. And so slowly, insidiously, he began to be left out. Not officially, not with malice, just quietly. He was not included in public appearances. His name was seldom mentioned in dispatches. When photographs were taken, he was sometimes absent without explanation. Even his siblings, young as they were, noticed his growing invisibility and began to mirror their parents' silence. No one told John he was different. No one explained why his brothers wore uniforms, and he didn't. No one said why they traveled abroad while he stayed behind, drawing birds in the dirt. He was born a prince. But as the royal world turned, slow, cold, and unforgiving, John remained still, a child left behind in the shadow of thrones, his place already shrinking before he ever had a chance to grow into it. And within the nursery halls of York Cottage, echoing with lullabies and closing doors, the boy who should have been a part of history began his slow descent into its footnotes. It came without warning, as most things do when they are destined to unravel the shape of a life, beginning not with a scream or a fall, but with a sudden, eerie stillness that settled over the nursery like a fog, like time had momentarily held its breath, as if even the walls of York Cottage sensed that something irreversible was about to happen to the smallest prince they housed. John was 4 years old. He had been playing, his pudgy hands clutching wooden blocks, arranging them not in castles like other children might, but in careful lines, color by color, size by size, as if he were trying to create order in a world that always seemed too loud, too bright, too fast. And then he stopped. The blocks dropped. His body tensed. His lips, moments before humming a fractured tune, parted in silence. He collapsed. Not in a graceful, sleepy slump, but in a violent convulsion that seized his limbs, arched his back, and twisted his small frame in ways that no child's body should ever contort. The sudden violence of it terrifying the nursemaid, who froze for a full second before lunging forward, her hands trembling as she tried to hold him down without hurting him, tried to stop his head from striking the floor, tried to remember the exact instruction given to her months ago in a conversation she'd dismissed as unnecessary. Foam frothed at his lips. His eyes rolled upward. His breath came in short, terrible jerks that sounded more like choking than breathing. And then it was over. He lay motionless, pale and damp with sweat, his chest rising in shallow gasps, unaware of the panic he had caused or the eyes that now stared at him, not with the warmth of maternal pride or even sisterly affection, but with an ancient fear. The fear of the broken child, the flawed heir, the sick limb of the bloodline. They called for the doctor, who arrived with a black bag and a face that quickly shifted from curiosity to concern. He examined the boy, listened to the nurse's account, and said little. The word seizure was spoken in a tone that suggested illness and disgrace were somehow intertwined. And though he offered no diagnosis, there were no firm labels in those days, only muttered Latin and speculative dread. There was already a decision forming in the silent exchanges between adults. It was not a fluke. It was not an isolated incident. It was the beginning of something far more serious, far more permanent, and they all knew it. Weeks passed, and for a time, hope flickered. John returned to his strange, lovely habits. Watching birds from the window for hours, tracing shadows across the carpet with his fingers, laughing when the wind rushed through the trees outside the nursery. But then came another seizure and another, until they became a cruel rhythm that governed his days. Moments of peace pierced by episodes so violent they left him gasping and dazed. His body aching, his spirit disoriented, as though pieces of him were being chipped away each time he was struck down. Some seizures were brief, lasting only seconds. Others stretched long enough to draw gasps from the staff, to make the doctor's hands shake as he tried in vain to ease the boy's suffering with crude tonics and whispered instructions. No one spoke to the Queen directly about the specifics. Queen Mary, ever poised, ever distant, preferred not to know the details. She visited less often, and when she did, she smiled too tightly, held him too briefly, and left too quickly. The king, now George V, remained stoic, his face unreadable in public and in private. He did not lash out. He did not express disappointment. But he also never touched the boy again. He watched from doorways, nodded at reports, and then moved on to matters of empire and war. A prince who shook on the floor was not a prince who could stand on balconies. A child who screamed in confusion was not one who could shake hands with diplomats. And so, bit by bit, John became invisible, even as he still lived under the same roof. His brothers noticed, in the way children do, not through conversation, but through absence. They saw that he no longer dined with them, that his toys remained untouched in the shared room, that when tutors arrived with books and maps and stern commands, John was never summoned. They were told he was unwell, and that was enough for them to accept the new order. 5 children in the public eye, 1 tucked away behind curtains and silence. In the medical records, such as they were, the term epileptic fits began to appear with frequency. The royal physicians documented the episodes, but had no real treatment beyond rest, isolation, and vague references to inherited weakness. Modern readers might suspect that epilepsy wasn't the only condition. His delayed language, erratic emotions, and hypersensitivity to touch or sound all suggest autism, perhaps even intellectual disability. But at the time, these were not distinctions the palace was prepared to entertain. To them, John was difficult, unruly, strange. He did not respond to discipline. He cried for no reason. He threw tantrums in front of visitors. He recoiled at sudden noises and clung desperately to routine. He could be charming, even delightful, when calm. But when the storm came, and it came often, he was terrifying to behold. One physician, more honest than most, confessed that the boy could never be fully trained. And for a royal household obsessed with order, image, and hierarchy, there was no greater sin than unpredictability. He became a problem to be managed, rather than a son to be loved. And though the staff tried, especially his nanny Lala, who never wavered in her devotion, there was only so much they could do to soften the growing distance between John and the rest of the world. The palace had already begun its quiet retreat from the boy's life, preparing even then for what would come later. A gentle exile, cloaked in the language of care and mercy, but rooted in shame and fear. Because the truth was, the seizures frightened them. Not just for what they did to John, but for what they revealed about the bloodline itself. A crack in the porcelain, a stain on the dynasty. A living reminder that royalty, for all its ceremony and splendor, could still be undone by a single, unpredictable child. And as another night passed, and another seizure struck, and another doctor left the nursery with downcast eyes and no answers, the decision became clearer. John could not remain in the light. He was a storm no one knew how to weather, and so he would be sent where storms would no longer be seen. John did not understand the rules, and more importantly, he did not feel compelled to follow them. Not because he was defiant, not because he was rebellious in any traditional sense, but because the intricate choreography of court life, with its invisible cues and stiff rituals, was written in a language he could not read, much less perform for the approval of a family that measured worth in silence and posture and the ability to sit still through hours of lessons without twitching or dreaming. While his brothers were taught Latin declensions and royal history, while they practiced their bows before stiff portraits of Queen Victoria and memorized the lineage of foreign monarchs with eyes fixed straight ahead, John would often wander from the room entirely, following the flicker of dust in the sunlight or the sound of a distant bird outside the window, drawn not to knowledge that could be wielded or displayed, but to the texture of leaves, the shapes clouds made when the wind stretched them thin, and the quiet companionship of his own inner world where no one demanded precision or poise. He did not speak like the others. His words came in bursts, sometimes in rhyme, sometimes echoing fragments he had heard the day before, and though he could laugh with delight or frown with fierce frustration, his emotions were rarely calibrated to the expectations of those around him, as if he experienced the world through a different lens, one that magnified the smallest beauties while also distorting the logic others took for granted. His nurses said he painted trees obsessively, each branch crooked in the exact same way, each leaf placed with care. But if someone moved his paper or shifted his crayons without asking, he would crumble, weeping as if the very axis of the earth had tilted under his feet. He screamed without warning, not as a weapon, but as a reaction. When the room was too loud, when someone touched him without preparation, when the light shifted too fast or a pattern broke. And though he never meant to frighten, fright is what he caused. Servants grew uneasy, never sure when a sudden outburst might startle a guest or shatter the calm required by royal presence. Tutors despaired, convinced the boy was unteachable, unreachable, unsalvageable in the eyes of a court that viewed every child as a project to be perfected. In another time, in another place, someone might have looked into his eyes and seen autism, a word that did not yet belong to the medical vocabulary of Edwardian England, but whose shape John embodied in every hesitant movement, every repeated phrase, every fixation on color and sound and rhythm. But in 1909, There was no room for nuance. There was only order and its opposite. And John, with all his quirks and compulsions, stood firmly in the latter. Doctors, summoned from the best London hospitals, scribbled down their impressions. Phrases like mental feebleness, idiopathic seizures, and developmental irregularities filled their reports. Vague enough to conceal ignorance, but sharp enough to justify exclusion. One even advised that John not be allowed to participate in formal education at all, lest his behavior unsettle the progress of his siblings or disturb the dignity of their shared lessons. It was not a diagnosis. It was a quiet dismissal. Queen Mary, increasingly uneasy in his presence, avoided long visits. She loved him in the way a royal mother could afford to love a son she could not showcase. A love filtered through concern, always conditional on composure. Never quite able to survive a tantrum in front of staff or a ruined photograph caused by an untimely scream. Her hands, always gloved, rarely lingered on his shoulder. Her eyes, when they looked at him, seemed to scan for improvement rather than connection, as if she were measuring how much of the boy could still be salvaged. And the king, ever silent, ever formal, spoke of him less and less. Behind palace doors, the word shame hovered like a shadow that never touched the floor, never spoken aloud, but ever present, shaping every decision made about the boy who could not be polished, could not be presented, could not be controlled. He was not sent to Eton like his brothers. There was no uniform waiting for him, no dormitory with polished shoes and crested blazers, no talk of military commissions or diplomatic futures. Instead, he remained in the private nursery wing, watched by a rotating staff who were instructed to keep him calm, keep him quiet, and, when important guests arrived, keep him away. He was allowed to garden sometimes, under supervision, allowed to paint, allowed to walk through the woods when the weather was fair and his health stable. But these were allowances, not privileges, doled out like sugar cubes to a horse kept behind a gate. And as he grew, his world narrowed. When his siblings returned from their lessons, John was already asleep. When they dressed for official photographs, he was tucked away with a nurse, his absence unspoken. When dignitaries arrived from overseas, the doors to his corridor were locked from the inside. And in time, he stopped asking why. Because no one ever told him. No one ever sat him down to explain what was happening to him. Why he was different. Why he couldn't go with his brothers. Why the rooms he was allowed to enter grew fewer each year. No one said the words that would have made the difference, even if they couldn't change the outcome. He was left instead with fragments, overheard whispers, the sound of his name in a tone of concern or regret or irritation. He began to understand, not with reason but with instinct, that he was not like the others. That his joy, when it appeared, was treated as a curiosity. That his pain, when it erupted, was endured but not embraced. That the palace he had been born into had doors that would never open for him, no matter how loudly he knocked or how many birds he drew to decorate its walls. And yet, within all this, he remained, in his own way, resilient. He still smiled when the rain tapped against the glass, still laughed when dogs chased one another in the garden, still reached out for the warmth of Nanny Lala, who, unlike the rest of the royal world, did not flinch when he cried or retreat when he shook. She told him stories, held his hand, let him paint as long as he liked. And in her presence, John found the only thing the palace had refused to grant him: acceptance without condition. But outside her arms, the reality never softened. Because the mind that did not bend to rules could not be allowed to exist among rulers. And so the verdict was quietly written. Not in law, not in policy, but in glances and absences, and the slow, deliberate act of being erased before the world ever knew you were there. There was no formal proclamation, no public bulletin issued from Buckingham Palace, no solemn press release wrapped in polished language to mark the moment a prince was removed from sight. Not because he had disgraced his family, not because he had committed some crime of state or rebellion, but because his very being, his softness, his unpredictability, and his trembling difference had become too glaring for the glasshouse image of monarchy to contain without cracking its carefully preserved illusion of perfection. He was 11 years old when the decision was made. Not with fanfare, not even with a whisper loud enough to echo beyond the drawing rooms of Sandringham. It came in the form of a carriage, neither ornate nor shrouded in secrecy, just practical, discreet, drawn by horses that did not know they were carrying a child into the margins of history. The departure happened one afternoon, unremarkable to everyone but the boy himself and the woman who sat beside him, Nanny Lala, whose hands trembled as she held a packed valise in her lap. Her other arm wrapped around the prince, whose face was pressed against the window pane as the trees of the estate blurred by like memories he hadn't lived long enough to claim. The destination was Wood Farm, a modest, quiet house tucked into the furthest corner of the Sandringham estate. A place so distant from the ceremonial heart of the royal world that it may as well have been another country, another life, another lifetime. Built originally as a hunting lodge or a staff residence, it was now repurposed. Not named a prison, never called an asylum, and yet functionally both. A place where John could live without disturbing the illusion that all was well in the House of Windsor. There were no guards, no locks, no punishments. But there were also no brothers, no formal tutors, no glittering visitors in carriages, no sound of trumpets calling the family to chapel, no footsteps on the palace stairs. Just John, his nurse, a cook, a housemaid, and silence. An ocean of silence into which the boy was gently, completely cast. From the outside, the arrangement could be, and was, described as merciful. The prince was too ill, they said, too fragile for public life, and Wood Farm would give him peace, safety, space to breathe and grow away from the pressures that might trigger his seizures or deepen his confusion. But inside its walls, the reality was more complicated, more heartbreaking, and far lonelier than any press secretary could have woven into a sanitized statement. Because John was not told what had happened or why. He only knew that he had been moved. He knew that one morning he had breakfasted in his usual nursery room, had watched the birds through the window he loved, had heard his brothers' voices in the corridor, and by nightfall, those sounds were gone, replaced by unfamiliar creaks in the floorboards, the wind scraping against different glass, the heavy quiet of a house not designed for laughter. He asked at first when he would return. He asked why his siblings hadn't come, and when no answer came, only gentle smiles, evasive words, and the unchanging routine of solitude, he stopped asking. In the daylight hours, when he felt well, he wandered the grounds. He was permitted to garden, to walk among the apple trees that bloomed beside the house, to crouch and inspect the patterns of bark on the trunks or whisper nonsense to passing insects. He collected stones, arranged sticks, drew birds again and again in chalk on the brick wall outside, always the same outline, always with outstretched wings, as if imagining flight from a place that had no gates but still would not let him leave. Sometimes he sang to himself, half-formed tunes with no melody, just rhythm and breath. Sometimes he stood still for hours, watching a single leaf tremble at the edge of a branch, his gaze fixed, unblinking, as if willing it to fall. But at night, when the shadows deepened and the pain returned, when the seizures stole across the threshold like wolves in fog, there was no one but Lala. Still devoted, still calm, still his anchor in the storm. She would cradle him on the floor when he convulsed, whispering his name, stroking his hair as his limbs spasmed and his eyes rolled back into his skull. She would clean the blood from his lip if he bit down too hard, would wrap him in blankets when the shaking stopped, would sit beside his bed with a candle burning long after the others in the house had gone to sleep, watching for the next wave, praying for a still night. There was no priest assigned to his soul, no doctor stationed permanently at the cottage, no counsel checking daily on his progress. Just Lala and the wind, and the boy who had once been a prince, now growing thinner, quieter, slowly fading into the wallpaper of Wood Farm, like a memory in the corner of a frame. And when the royal family posed for portraits, lined in perfect symmetry, all dressed in brocade and brass button coats, John was never painted, not once. His name was not struck from the record, not explicitly, but it was left out often enough to make its absence feel natural. Newspapers reported on the activities of his siblings, their schooling, their visits to the continent, their public appearances beside their regal parents. But they made no mention of the youngest. It became easier to pretend he had never been there, never laughed, never drawn, never wept in Queen Mary's lap before she stopped calling him to her chambers. To his siblings, especially the older ones, the removal had been softened into inevitability. They were told John needed rest, needed quiet, that he was ill and would be safer away from the strain of court. Some of them accepted that. Some asked questions and were answered with tight-lipped repetitions. And over time, they too stopped asking. The absence became routine. The silence surrounding him grew thicker. And yet, at Wood Farm, the seasons changed. Spring crept in, green and wet, bringing daffodils around the edges of the garden wall. Summer poured gold across the fields. Autumn dropped its red and rust leaves where John could gather them and press them into books he never read. Winter painted the windows with frost, through which he would breathe little clouds onto the glass and draw his birds again, over and over, in white-fingered repetition. Through all of it, he remained. Not imprisoned, not punished, simply tucked away. A prince no longer seen, no longer expected, no longer asked to be anything at all. And for the monarchy, that was enough. But for the boy, it was a kind of death that came long before the body gave out. A life where every door remained physically open, yet emotionally bolted shut. A life where not being chosen didn't mean he had failed, only that he had never been considered worthy to begin with. And so, day by day, drawing by drawing, seizure by seizure, John began to disappear, not from the world, but from its memory. There were moments, brief, bright, and so fragile they could barely hold their own weight, when the boy who had once been called Prince John seemed, for a fleeting heartbeat, to forget the weight of his name, the loneliness of his exile, and the silence of the family that had turned its face away from him. And in those rare, flickering windows of time, he danced. Not on a stage, not before an audience, not under chandeliers in marble halls, but barefoot on the damp grass behind Wood Farm, his arms outstretched, fingers grazing the air as he spun in erratic, joyful circles under a sky too wide to judge him, his laughter echoing off hedges and tree trunks like wind chimes caught in a gust. He would chase leaves that fluttered in slow descent, delighted by their swirling pattern, and sometimes collapse beside the garden wall, clutching handfuls of soil with the same reverence others reserved for rosaries, whispering to beetles and moss, content to be unnoticed, unseen, and, just for that hour, not restrained by the expectations of a world that had never made space for his kind of beauty. But those moments never lasted, because the storms always came. They arrived without warning, sometimes in the dead stillness of night, sometimes mid-afternoon when the light fell just so through the cottage windows, casting moving shadows that seemed to awaken something volatile inside him. As if his mind, so sensitive, so porous, absorbed not just joy and rhythm, but also chaos. And that chaos demanded release in the form of seizure, tremor, and terrifying silence. His body, already slight and fragile, would tense with a suddenness that frightened even the most seasoned caretakers. His legs would lock, his arms flail in spasms that seemed to shake not just his frame, but the very soul beneath it. And his mouth would contort as if trying to scream, though no sound emerged except for the wet gurgle of a breath that might not return. And it was always Lala, Nanny Lala, his guardian in every way but name, who came running first. She would lift him from the ground with a strength fueled more by love than muscle, wrap her arms around him to stop him from injuring himself on the hard wooden bedposts, shice, or the iron edges of the hearth, and speak to him not in commands or diagnosis, but in fairy tale fragments, half lullabies, and the names of birds he used to paint. Robin, sparrow, swallow, little lark. It's all right, it's all right, it's going to pass. Sometimes he heard her, sometimes he didn't. Sometimes his eyes, rolled back in seizure, would focus for a second on her face, and he would blink as if surfacing from a dream made of fire and water, only to be pulled back under again, his limbs thrashing until they gave out, and he collapsed in her lap, soaked in sweat, trembling with aftershocks, too weak to speak, too dazed to cry. And afterward, there was always silence, not peace, just the fragile, suspended quiet of a child trying to reassemble the world in his head after it has been ripped apart and scrambled into 1,000 jagged pieces, many of which would never quite fit back together. The garden, once his sanctuary, became both playground and battlefield. There were days when he would lie under the oak tree for hours, watching the light shift through the leaves, his fingers brushing the moss in rhythmic strokes that soothed him like a lullaby no one else could hear. He'd hum to himself, sometimes mimic the chirp of a nearby thrush, and hold out his hand as if he expected the bird to land on his wrist, unafraid, as if the animals of the estate understood what the humans did not, that John meant no harm, that he carried more wonder in his broken mind than most did in their whole polished lives. But those days were rare. More often, the garden bore witness to suffering. More often, the flowers bent under his weight as he collapsed into them, seizing, foaming, convulsing in their softness, bruising petals beneath his knees, smearing dirt across his face, the quiet, private agony of a child who could not explain what was happening to him, and who would not, even if he could, be understood. There were no official records of these episodes. No doctors stationed on call, no scrolls of medical observation penned for royal archives, no trained hands to take over when Lala faltered with exhaustion or wept behind the pantry door once the worst had passed. Just her notes, if she had time to write them, and her memory, overflowing with too many nights spent cradling a boy she had raised like a son, watching his innocence dissolve into seizures, and wondering how the world could abandon someone so utterly, so deliberately, so cruelly. And yet, despite everything, John never stopped loving the outside, never stopped wanting the wind on his face, the sensation of grass underfoot, the moment where, just before the aura of a seizure, the world became unnaturally bright, almost holy, as if the veil between him and something greater had momentarily lifted. He would reach out in those moments, stretch his arms skyward, laugh sometimes, or freeze, eyes wide, as if hearing music no one else could hear. He never called it suffering. He had no words for it. He never asked for pity, only presence, only someone to hold his hand as the tremors came, only someone to be there when he opened his eyes again. And for years, that someone was only ever Lala. Not his mother, not his father, not his brothers or the palace physicians or the Church of England or the empire that bore his name on its maps, but not on its heart. Just Lala, kneeling in the dirt with her arms around him as the sky turned gray, whispering, "You're safe, my darling. You're safe." But was he? Was he safe in a world that hid him away rather than help him? Was he safe in a garden where no one ever visited? Where laughter echoed off empty windows and no footsteps ever approached that didn't belong to staff? Or had he simply been placed in a soft, quiet box? One with flowers and birds and toys. But still a box? Because no matter how tender the hands that held him, or how lovingly the grass cradled him after a fall, the truth was plain in every silence that followed, in every birthday uncelebrated, every visitor who never came. This garden was not freedom. It was a padded cage. And in that cage lived a child the world had declared unfit to be seen. It had been a quiet day, the kind of winter day when the cold settles like an old friend, not sharp or cruel, but still enough to draw breath in shorter intervals, when clouds hang low and unmoving over the frosted garden, and the sky never quite decides whether to snow or stay gray. And inside the creaking walls of Wood Farm, the boy who had once been a prince had spent his morning in the company of paint and silence. His fingers, always unsteady, had guided the brush with a trembling grace over paper that curled at the edges from the heat of the fireplace. And though the paint had dripped and smudged, and though the form was imperfect and the lines uneven, he had smiled, with that rare kind of smile that reaches the eyes and then vanishes before anyone can hold on to it. He had painted a bird, just like always. A bird mid-flight, its wings arched skyward as though it could escape what he never could. He had hummed as he worked. Not a song exactly, but a pattern of sound that rose and fell like breath in a dream. Something known only to Webb. A private melody that perhaps only the wind or the ghosts of forgotten gardens could follow. And Lala, who knew when to speak and when to remain invisible, had sat nearby knitting, glancing at him through the firelight, her heart heavy and tender in equal measure. In the afternoon, he had eaten a little, bread with honey, a sip of warm milk, and then had asked to go outside despite the frost on the ground and the mist that hugged the hedges like a shroud. And because he asked so rarely for anything, and because his eyes that day had the same glint they'd had years ago before the seizures became more frequent and his strength began to ebb in ways even Lala couldn't deny, she let him go. He walked through the garden in his worn woolen coat, gloves too large for his hands, scarf trailing slightly behind, leaving small, uneven footprints in the grass that had turned stiff with ice. He touched the wall where he used to draw, now washed clean by rain and time, and he stood under the bare branches of the old apple tree as if listening for something. Perhaps the sound of his own past, or the echo of brothers' laughter he hadn't heard in years, or maybe just the whisper of a world that had once promised him more than 4 walls and a nursemaid's kindness. And then he returned inside, chilled and tired, but content in the only way he knew how to be. By evening, he had curled beneath his blankets, the fire crackling softly. And Lala had read to him, a story he'd heard many times before, one about a prince and a bird and a journey that ended in sunlight. He did not speak much, only nodded from time to time. And when she kissed his forehead, he closed his eyes without protest, sighing as though sleep was something he had finally made peace with. But the night was not finished with him. Just after midnight, when the house was dark and the fire had faded to embers, when even the mice in the attic had gone still and the trees outside swayed without wind, the seizure struck. It came like a jolt of lightning through still water, sudden and absolute. A cruel return of the force that had haunted him since his 4th year, and now seemed to gather all its wrath for one final act. His body arched, eyes wide in panic, breath caught mid-gasp like a bird snared mid-flight, and the bed creaked beneath him as though it, too, could feel the violence of what was happening. Lala woke instantly. She had grown used to the rhythm, the crash, the silence, the cry. And yet something about this seizure was different. Not in volume or movement, but in weight. In the way the air shifted around him, heavier than before, as though the room itself knew what was coming. She reached him before he could fall from the bed, cradled his head in her lap, whispered his name over and over. Though his eyes had already begun to glaze and his limbs shook not like before, but with a desperation that seemed to scream without sound. There were no doctors to call, no palace staff to summon in the dead of night, no royal bells or pages on standby. There was only Lala, and the boy who shook in her arms, and the quiet terror of watching a life slip away, not with spectacle or ceremony, but in the cold shadow of an unremarkable January night. His fingers clawed briefly at her sleeve, grasping not out of fear but habit. The same way he had held her hand as a toddler when the world became too much. His lips parted, but no words came. His chest heaved once, twice, then stilled. And just like that, he was gone. There was no last proclamation, no whispered goodbye, no candle flickered out with poetic timing. There was just the sound of Lala weeping quietly, her tears soaking the curls on his still warm head, rocking him back and forth like a child she had only just met, like a mother who never got to claim the name. She did not call for anyone right away. She sat with him for hours, long after the tremors had stopped, long after the color had drained from his face, long after the birds outside began to stir in the pale light of morning. She sat because she could not imagine rising, because leaving the room would mean accepting what the doctors had always warned, what the palace had always feared, what the world had never prepared her for. That the boy who had once danced in the garden, who had painted birds with trembling hands, who had lived in exile not for crime, but for difference, had died as quietly as he had been hidden. And when the staff finally found her, when they entered the room and saw her holding him like he might still wake, none of them knew what to say. Because there were no protocols for mourning a prince who had already been erased, no guidelines for how to grieve a child the crown had already let go of, no ceremony for a boy who had been a secret long before he became a memory, only a silence deeper than any winter frost, and a nurse still rocking, and a child still warm, and a night that would never end. There are deaths that echo through a nation like thunder across a valley, deaths that stop clocks, that lower flags, that summon black-clad dignitaries from distant shores, each step measured, each tear accounted for, each syllable of grief rehearsed in marble chambers where sorrow itself becomes a kind of performance, meticulously choreographed for the benefit of posterity and prestige. And then there are deaths like his. There was no flag lowered over Buckingham Palace, no moment of national silence requested from the people, no procession down the mall, no velvet-draped carriage, no rows of solemn soldiers lining the streets with polished boots and downcast eyes, no cathedral bells tolling across London to mark the extinguishing of a royal light. Instead, there was a line, just one, tucked deep in the middle of the Times newspaper 2 days later, written in the same font used to announce bank mergers and grain shortages, which simply read, "Prince John, youngest son of their Majesties King George V and Queen Mary, died peacefully at Sandringham." Peacefully. A word so absurd it almost seemed cruel, considering the years of seizures, the countless nights convulsing on wooden floors, the tremors that left bruises beneath his skin and confusion behind his eyes, the solitude that hollowed out his childhood like rot in a tree, and yet, there it stood, printed in ink that could not capture the weight of a life unlived. There was no official mourning declared. Not because the family didn't grieve in their own way, though even that, for some, remained uncertain, but because to mourn him publicly would have been to acknowledge him publicly, to confirm the presence of a boy whose existence had already been gently folded out of frame, whose name had not appeared in official programs or public ceremonies for years, whose photographs were always a few years out of date and always cropped just wide enough to remove his empty seat. No black armbands adorned the sleeves of ministers, no national addresses were made in his honor, no royal wreaths were displayed for the crowds to see. Instead, the body was transported to Frogmore, the royal burial grounds just beyond the shadow of Windsor Castle, a place where many of his ancestors rested, though few would ever remember he lay among them. The funeral, if it could be called that, was small, quiet, almost private, attended not by the whole court, not by representatives of every commonwealth, but by a handful of family members. His mother, cold and composed, one or two siblings, still too young to understand the full scope of what had been lost, and Lala, her eyes red but dry, her hands trembling as she tucked a folded piece of his painting, one of the many birds he loved, into the casket before it was closed. There were no hymns requested by John, no eulogies written, no final words delivered in his voice, because his voice had never been heard outside the walls of Wood Farm, and certainly not within the halls of the palace. To the kingdom, he had been the shadow child, a name whispered and then forgotten, a life summarized in medical euphemisms and clipped explanations. He had not earned the titles his brothers bore. No Duke of Gloucester, no Colonel-in-Chief, no future consort, no lineage to continue. And so, in the eyes of the crown, there was little to mourn publicly, because nothing had been invested publicly. No expectations, no triumphs, only the quiet administrative burden of a child who could not be fixed. And so the institution moved on, barely a beat skipped. Within days, the papers returned to headlines about the post-war economy, about the lingering influenza epidemic, about the king's schedule and foreign visits. Within weeks, John's name was absent entirely. By spring, even palace staff had ceased referring to his room at Wood Farm. It was being readied for other use, perhaps to house visiting attendants or distant cousins. Its walls to be painted over, its drawers cleared of the scattered remnants of a boyhood endured alone. And yet, for Lala, no such transition was possible. She returned to the room for weeks after his burial, sitting at the window where he had once drawn spirals in the frost, with his fingertip opening the wardrobe not because she needed anything, but because his scent still lingered on the collar of his coat, on the sleeves of his nightshirt. She spoke to him sometimes, not as a ghost, not in madness, but in remembrance, quietly, in the same voice she had used to calm him during storms, as if part of her still expected a giggle or a moan, a tremble of movement beneath the sheets. She had loved him fiercely, Not as a royal, not as a symbol, but as a boy. Fragile, misunderstood, filled with colors no one else had the patience to see. And for her, the burial had not closed the chapter. It had only made the silence heavier. For the rest of the royal family, grief was tidier, if it existed at all. Queen Mary, in her letters, mentioned John sparingly. Brief nods to his suffering, acknowledgments of his passing. But rarely more than that. "He is at peace," she wrote once. "God has spared him further distress." King George V never spoke of him again in public, and by most accounts, barely did so in private. The other children continued their lessons, their military training, their court appearances. One less sibling meant one less complication. The machinery of monarchy could run smoother now. And so it did. But in that smoothing came forgetting. And in that forgetting came erasure. Within a decade, school children in England could name all 5 royal siblings and never learn there had been a 6th. Within 2 decades, biographies of King George V omitted John entirely, or mentioned him in a footnote with phrases like "sickly child" or "died young." Within 3 decades, even royal genealogies began to skip his name, as if the space between the 5th and 6th child had always been empty. He became the prince who had never been, not denied existence, but denied memory. And for those who had known him, truly known him, not as a liability or a diagnosis, but as the boy who had once drawn birds in the garden and danced in circles until the sky made him dizzy. His death was not just a loss of life, but a loss of presence. Because death is final, but forgetting is forever. And what killed Prince John, in the end, was not just a seizure. It was a silence too deep to scream through. A history too proud to make space for the soft and the strange. A crown too heavy for a child who only ever wanted someone to hold his hand. And when that child was buried, the crown stayed polished. The portraits remained unedited. The flags flew for others. But for the boy himself, no trumpet sounded, no chapter closed, no tear recorded. Time, that most reliable accomplice to forgetting, moved onward without resistance, sweeping away footprints from the frost-covered garden paths of Wood Farm, silencing the echoes of laughter and seizure alike, until even the birds that once perched outside the prince's window ceased to return. And the house that had once contained his world was just another anonymous building on the edge of a royal estate, inhabited now by caretakers who did not know the name of the boy who had once whispered to shadows within its walls. It was not deliberate, this erasure. It was not as though some royal hand crossed him out in ink from the family ledger with malice or calculation, but rather a quiet process, born from discomfort and image control. The kind of forgetting that begins with a change in subject, a misfiled photograph, a blank spot on the seating chart, and ends with absence so complete that even those born long after would not know a space had once been occupied. When portraits were hung in the great halls of Windsor and Sandringham, those grand oil canvases of the monarch and his 5 children, standing in symmetrical splendor beneath crests and gilded borders, there was never a vacant chair to hint at the 6th. The composition was perfect, the symmetry undisturbed, and no one asked where the youngest had gone, because no one was ever told he had been there at all. At royal events, when the children's names were read aloud in introductions and processions, they were recited with ceremonial clarity: Edward, Albert, Mary, Henry, George. But John's name had already dissolved from memory like breath from glass. A warmth once present now evaporated entirely, and no polite society guest dared question whether there had ever been a 6th child. Because in a world ruled by image, absence speaks less loudly than imperfection. even within the private annals of the royal family. Those volumes of lineage and legacy kept with obsessive care in leather-bound books and velvet-lined drawers, the record of Prince John gradually shrank. First to a footnote, then to a line, then to a vague reference. Died young, sickly, not fit for public life. Until, in some editions, his name disappeared altogether, not as an act of censorship, but as the inevitable result of a system that does not know how to preserve what it cannot celebrate. By the mid-20th century, school children in Britain could recite the names of the royal heirs with precision, identify the contributions of their reigns and the noble virtues attributed to them. But none could tell you about the boy who lived in a cottage and painted birds, who danced on grass when he was well and trembled alone when he was not, who died at 13 without a title and without a narrative, because history had deemed his story unworthy of its ink. In documentaries and official biographies, he was either omitted entirely or referred to obliquely, described as a delicate child or unfortunate in health, as though delicacy were a fault, as though the frailty of his body and the complexity of his mind had not been shaped as much by isolation as by illness, as though the shame of having housed him in silence was still more unbearable than the shame of having lost him. The royal archives, which documented everything from the pattern of the Queen's handkerchiefs to the daily menus served at Balmoral, held little about John. No journals, no recordings, few letters, fewer memories. Just a handful of medical notes written in the detached language of clinical failure. A smattering of photographs where he was still young enough to be mistaken for someone else's child. And a series of letters from Lala, whose handwriting grew shakier with each passing year, but whose loyalty never waned. It was Lala, in fact. More than his parents, more than his siblings, more than the historians who would later resurrect his name, who refused to let him vanish completely, who saved his drawings, his broken crayons, his favorite books worn at the edges from his hands turning the pages again and again. Not to read the words, but to see the pictures. She preserved them, not because she believed the world would one day care, but because she did. She was the last person who whispered his name aloud every day. She was the last person who remembered the weight of his body, the sound of his laughter, the precise way he curled into her side after a seizure passed. And when she died, so too did the last living memory that had been held without obligation. Decades passed. The monarchy evolved. New kings and queens rose and fell. New wars were fought. New crises filled the headlines. And through it all, the story of Prince John remained locked behind a door no one wanted to open. Not because they feared what was inside, but because they feared the silence they would find waiting. When journalists finally asked about him in the latter half of the century, tentatively in footnotes and interviews, the answers they received were vague, rehearsed, and brief. He was unwell. He lived quietly. He died young. But no one said the truth aloud, that he had been forgotten before he died, that he had been banished not for what he did, but for what he was. That he had carried the cost of being different in a family that prized uniformity above all else. And so he remained. A ghost in the family tree, neither myth nor martyr, just a blank space where a life should have been. His story folded between pages. No one turned, his name fading each time someone chose not to speak it. He was not a scandal, not a tragedy the palace wanted buried, just an inconvenience too tender to display. A wound that never bled openly, only bruised the lineage in ways easier to ignore than explain. And in that forgetting, something was lost. Not only for him, but for the monarchy itself. Because a family that cannot claim all of its children cannot claim all of its humanity. Because a crown that denies weakness cannot wear its history without shame. Because a country that forgets its most vulnerable sons will always remember only the strength it pretends was never broken. And in the garden where he once painted, where the trees still cast long shadows over the frost-covered stones, the wind still moves as it did when he danced. And if you listen closely, it almost sounds like breath. It would take nearly a century for his name to be spoken again without discomfort, without shame, without the averted gaze of biographers skimming over the sixth child like a footnote in the margins of a golden family narrative. And by the time the world was finally ready to hear the story of Prince John, the cottage where he had lived had long since been repainted, the garden overgrown, and the hands that once held him through trembling had returned to earth, leaving only artifacts, fragments, and silence. The rediscovery did not begin with ceremony or royal declaration. There was no sudden unveiling of a forgotten archive, no memorial speech by a reigning monarch claiming kinship to a boy exiled by their predecessors. Only a slow, almost accidental uncovering by scholars, archivists, and storytellers who, while tracing the lines of royal genealogy or reviewing photographs from Edwardian years, began to notice the same recurring absence, the same missing face, the same empty space where a child should have stood. It was in these silences that questions took root. Who was the sixth child? Where did he go? Why did no one speak of him? And when the answers began to emerge, not through confession, but through scraps of letters, caretaker journals, household reports, and forgotten medical records, what they revealed was not some great scandal, not some monstrous truth hidden behind the velvet curtain, but something far more devastating in its quietness. A boy, sick and sensitive, born into splendor only to be pushed gently, firmly, and permanently away, because the world into which he had been born had no room for difference. In the 1970s and 1980s, as the language of disability began to evolve, and societies around the globe slowly began to confront the inhumanity of how they had treated those who could not conform to the invisible scripts of normality, Prince John's story started to be whispered again, not with judgment, but with a growing ache, a sense that something sacred had been neglected. Historians, curious and increasingly compassionate, began piecing together the life behind the name that had vanished from royal narratives. They traced medical descriptions of fits and nervous irregularities, read through the few remaining pages of Lala's letters, re-examined photographs where he appeared blurry, squinting in the sunlight, sometimes smiling, sometimes turned away. And from these fragments, they tried to give him back something that had never fully belonged to him in life. A voice. Books followed, articles in academic journals, then documentaries. Then, in 2003, a BBC television drama titled The Lost Prince aired to critical acclaim, not because it dramatized a secret scandal, but because it did something rare and radical in the realm of royal storytelling. It centered a life that had previously been considered irrelevant, unimportant, unfit for focus. In that retelling, John was not reduced to diagnosis. He was not portrayed as a burden or a mistake. He was a child, funny, difficult, vibrant, frightened, and full of longing. And for the first time, the world saw not a case, not a shameful branch on the royal tree, but a human being. Viewers wept. Letters poured in. People wrote of their own sons and daughters, of siblings and cousins, of lives lost not to illness, but to institutional rejection, to quiet removal, to the cold hands of families who could not or would not carry what they could not cure. And in doing so, John became a mirror, not just for the House of Windsor, but for every home that had once hidden its most vulnerable. The palace, for its part, did not respond with public remorse or apologies. No plaque was installed at Wood Farm. No special remembrance was declared at Frogmore. But something subtle shifted. New biographies of King George V began including John with more detail, more care. Royal exhibitions at Windsor Castle displayed for the first time some of his childhood belongings, his paintbrushes, his favorite toy soldier, a pair of mittens knit by Lala herself, the edges worn thin from frequent use. And though his name had once been left out of official narratives, by the early 21st century it was finally printed again, not hidden, not euphemized, just there, among his siblings, as it always should have been. Yet even this return was bittersweet, because no amount of remembering can undo the years of forgetting. No modern praise can erase the quiet horror of a boy dying in a room no royal entered. No display of toys can make up for a childhood spent in exile from his own family's embrace. And for those who studied his life closely, who read the letters, the photographs, the medical entries, what emerged was not just grief, but guilt. A realization that John had not died simply from epilepsy, or even from the weight of his own body's collapse, but from a far more devastating force: the absence of love where love had been needed most. There were no medals for him, no titles, no legacy of policy or victory or patronage. But in the quiet decades after his death, John achieved something his brothers, for all their power, could not. He became a symbol, not of empire, but of empathy. A reminder that dignity is not granted by a crown, that a child need not earn affection, that visibility should never be conditional upon perfection. And as schools began to teach his story, as documentaries continued to circulate, as new generations encountered the image of a young boy standing barefoot on frosted grass, one arm reaching upward as if chasing a bird he could never quite catch, the world began to do what the monarchy had once refused. It remembered him. Not because he changed the world, but because he deserved to live in it fully. And in that memory, imperfect and belated as it was, something healing stirred. Not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been pushed aside, locked away, or left unspoken in a family, a nation, or a history that had once claimed to love them. And so, at last, the ghost in the family tree was given back his name. Prince John, child of kings, boy of silence, painter of birds. Lost, yes, but never again unseen. He was never meant to be king. He would never wear the crown, never lead a war, never sit at the head of a state dinner beneath chandeliers the size of carriages, never shake the hands of ambassadors or sign decrees in red wax. His life was not a life of public speeches or polished boots or triumphant parades. And yet, it was taken from him all the same. Not by war, not by poison, not by treason or illness alone, but by the far more mundane and far more cruel verdict of a society that decided early, irrevocably, and without appeal, that there was no place for a child like him in the architecture of kings. He was different. He was unpredictable. He was human in ways the system could not tolerate. In the end, Prince John did not die of epilepsy alone, though that was the word they wrote down. The clinical word, the safe word, the word that could be whispered by doctors and etched in ink on a death certificate. What killed him, slowly, invisibly, and with exquisite politeness, was abandonment, the absence of touch, the scarcity of acknowledgement. The years of being treated not as a boy with seizures, but as a problem to be removed from sight, smoothed from history, folded into silence like a tear-stained letter tucked deep inside a drawer no one opened again. He never broke a law. He never disobeyed out of spite. He never asked for more than a moment of peace, a space to play, a voice to answer his questions, not even the complicated ones, but the small ones. Why am I not going with them? Why does Mother not stay long? Why can't I come back to the big house? And no one ever told him. No one said, because you scare them. No one said, because your shaking reminds them they are fragile too. No one said, because in a world built on control, there is no throne for someone who cannot sit still. He was not cursed. He was not dangerous. He was a child. A boy who hummed to himself, who painted birds with too many wings and too few lines, who laughed when the light danced through the window and sobbed when routines were broken, who sought patterns in flower beds and faces, who cried when his siblings left for school and never took him along, who danced barefoot in the frost because no one ever taught him not to. And he died holding no one's hand but the only woman who never left him. History tends to remember power. It carves the names of kings who conquered, queens who ruled, princes who rode into battle, heirs who married strategically and fathered dynasties. But what does it do with the soft ones? The ill, the trembling, the unseen? What does it do with the children who did not fit the mold, but were still born into the tapestry, still carried royal blood, still bore titles that did not protect them? For decades, it did nothing. It erased, it edited, it moved on. But perhaps now, finally, we can choose differently. Perhaps now we can remember him not as a footnote or a flaw, but as something else entirely. As a kind of truth the monarchy could not face. A kind of courage the palace did not recognize. A kind of love that survived only in the arms of a nanny who saw the boy before the bloodline. Perhaps now, as we retell his story, not to accuse, but to understand, we can see how systems built to glorify the strong often discard the vulnerable, how the pageantry of royalty can mask the quiet cruelty of abandonment, and how remembering the forgotten is not a rewriting of history, but a restoring of it. Prince John was not a symbol of failure. He was not a shame to be concealed. He was not a chapter to be skipped. He was what every child is before the world tells them otherwise, whole. And his death, as quiet as it was, as unmarked by trumpet or flag, now calls to us, not for pity, but for recognition. That difference is not a flaw. That softness is not a sin. That humanity, raw, trembling, ungoverned, is not something to be hidden. It is something to be honored. And if the boy who once lived in a garden, who once painted birds, who once seized in the night and smiled in the morning, can now be remembered not as a ghost, but as a child, not as a secret, but as a son, not as an error, but as a presence, then perhaps, in that act of remembering, we become more human too. I did not know him. None of us truly did. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the cruelty wasn't in how he died, but in how he was never known while he lived. If telling his story makes you pause, makes you wonder who else we've silenced just for being different, then perhaps his voice, though buried, has finally broken through the walls. And that is something no crown can erase.